At first light, Staff Sergeant Drew Kim crossed the black mat before the tomb of the unknown soldier, with his boots clicking in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, while mist held low over Arlington's white headstones, and the marble took the morning sun like a blade. He stood 6'2" and built like a wall that had learned to move without wasting a single motion. His uniform was immaculate. Every crease was sharp enough to cut glass. His buttons held the first light in hard points of gold. White gloves remained pristine against the dark stock of the M14 on his shoulder, and his kepi sat at the exact angle, required not by comfort, but by standard. To strangers, he looked carved from stone and set in place by history itself. To those who had worn a uniform, he looked like discipline distilled into human form. The hill breathed in silence. Oak leaves along the walk had just begun to bronze at their edges, and the October cold laid a fine brightness across the stone. To the east, rows of markers ran down the slope in measured lines, each one white, each one level, each one carrying a name, a rank, a date, or sometimes less than that. The tomb stood at the crest in pale marble and shadow, severe and simple, and the inscription faced the waking sky as if it had been waiting there since the first flag was raised over the first grave. The crowd had gathered in the way crowds gather at sacred places, not by command but by instinct. Veterans with weathered faces stood with hands clasped at their belts, branch pins on faded caps catching stray threads of sunlight. A father in a denim jacket lowered his son gently from his shoulders so the boy could stand straight on his own feet. A high school group went still in matching sweatshirts, phones down, teachers silent beside them. An elderly couple in matching windbreakers leaned on each other without speaking. Near the rail, a woman in a nurse's coat held a folded program against her chest with both hands as if it might steady her breathing. No one needed instruction in those moments. The cadence taught them. Drew's pace gave the morning a spine. 21 steps. A pause exactly long enough for the world to notice its own heartbeat. A turn executed with the exact geometry of tradition. Then 21 more. The old rhythm, older than every person standing there, moved across the mat and through the crowd until whispers thinned and then vanished. A child tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why does he walk like that?" The mother bent and answered in the quiet tone people use in churches, "To honor people who never came home." The child watched, wide-eyed, and did not ask another question. Drew heard none of it in the ordinary way, yet he registered all of it. Externally, he remained motionless at each facing, eyes fixed on a point beyond the immediate crowd, jaw set, expression unreadable. Internally, his awareness moved like a grid laid across the plaza. He tracked distance, posture, unusual movement, hand placement, and the subtle pressure, changes that happen whenever one body cut into another space. A jacket zipper pulled too quickly, a backpack dropped too hard, a shoulder line that didn't match the person's stated intention. The same instincts that had once measured alley mouths in Kandahar now measured railings, pathways, and the arc between spectators and the mat. To everyone else, he was ceremonial. In truth, he was active in every direction. The sentinel's duty was ritual, but ritual at Arlington was never theater. It was structure for grief. It was public memory rendered in physical law. The mat was not just black stone under polished heels. It was a boundary between the living and the cost of their living. Drew carried that understanding in his spine. He had learned it before he was assigned there, learned it in dust and rotor wash and metal, but the tomb gave that knowledge a shape civilians could witness. The measured pass became a vow, repeated until repetition itself became meaning. At 700, the light strengthened, and the marble brightened from gray to white. A park volunteer near the path closed his logbook and stood at attention for the changing sequence, shoulders pulled back as if an old drill voice had reached him from decades away. Two middle-aged men wearing old unit hoodies removed their caps and held them over their hearts without looking at each other. A teenage girl with purple streaks in her hair wiped her eyes with her sleeve, startled by her own reaction. An older Marine in a VFW cap, broad hands marked with age spots and old scars, adjusted his footing and stood straighter. Drew completed another cycle. The heel strike rang clear on the mat. Turn. Pause. Return. One tourist, speaking too loudly in the first minutes, had entered with a grin and a running commentary for his companion. By the third circuit, his voice had dropped. By the fifth, he had gone silent entirely. Arlington did that to people. It did not argue. It did not negotiate. It presented the arithmetic of sacrifice with such plain force that even the distracted recognized it. A docent near the rear rail murmured to a cluster of students not to teach over the cadence, but to meet it between steps. The Sentinel's standards are exacting. They rehearse until movement becomes instinct, not for show, for respect. She let the words fall and lowered her chin as Drew passed the center point again. The wind shifted slightly from the river, cool enough to raise gooseflesh along exposed forearms. Flags in the distance moved in restrained ripples. No snapping, just steady motion. The scent of trimmed grass mingled with old stone and morning damp. Somewhere farther down the slope, maintenance equipment hummed once and then stopped, as if even machines understood boundaries when they reached this hill. Drew's face did not change, but memory moved through him with the regularity of his stride. Not the sharp, jagged memories that woke men in the dark, but the disciplined kind, placed and ordered and carried. He remembered the first time his drill instructor told him that bearing was not vanity, it was protection. Hold your line, and you hold the line for everyone behind you. He remembered the first day he watched a senior sentinel run uniform inspection by sight alone and reject a thread no civilian eye could have detected. He remembered being told that the tomb did not belong to those who guarded it. It belonged to the unknowns and to the families who never got to stand where this marble stood. Those lessons lived in his posture. His shoulders remained square, rifle secure, chin level. The cadence never rushed to satisfy an impatient observer and never slowed for sentiment. Precision was compassion here. Consistency was mercy. The crowd did not need performance. It needed reliability. One measured pass after another, proof that duty still existed in a world that often mistook volume for authority. By 7:15, more visitors had come up the walk in small clusters, guided by maps, wheelchairs, canes, and the gentle hand pressure of family members moving at different speeds. A grandfather with an oxygen tube stood at the back until a younger veteran noticed and offered him the rail spot without a word. A pair of middle school boys stopped fidgeting and mirrored each other unconsciously, heels together, hands by their seams. A woman with a gold star pin on her lapel closed her eyes through one full cycle, lips moving in a private prayer, then opened them as Drew passed and set her jaw with visible effort. No one applauded. No one should have. This was not a performance to cheer, it was witness. The ceremonial circuit resumed. 21 paces, the measured halt, the precise turn, and 21 back. The rising sun cut past the cloud edge and lit the marble face in full. For a brief minute, the letters looked carved from light rather than stone. Drew's boot soles, polished to mirror shine, flashed and darkened with each pass, rhythm holding even as the brightness changed around him. The black mat reflected his movement in faint, distorted bands, a ghost sentinel beneath the real one, both bound to the same law of motion. A boy near the front whispered, "Does he ever get tired?" His grandfather, an infantryman in another century, answered without taking his eyes off the mat. "Of course. He does it anyway." That quiet exchange settled into the morning like another layer of truth. Strength at this place was not noise or spectacle. It was restraint with purpose. Drew's restraint carried the weight of the fallen and set it down gently in public view, where strangers could feel it, and walk away changed in ways they might not have words for until much later. At 07:30, the cemetery bells from a nearby chapel marked the quarter hour, soft and distant. Drew did not alter a fraction. The cadence stayed exact, neither acknowledging nor resisting the bell, simply continuing through it. The crowd remained fixed, held by the same gravity that had pulled generations to this hill. In the rear, a janitor on break removed his cap and stood with his cart unattended. A jogger who had paused on the path stayed until the cycle completed, breathing fog into the morning as if unwilling to disturb what he had entered. Drew reached the center line again and halted for the measured pause. His eyes locked on a point only he could see, and in that stillness the entire terrace seemed to hold with him. Veterans, tourists, children, widows, workers, all of them gathered beneath one cold sky, all of them sharing the same unspoken recognition that some promises were made for life and kept step by step. Then he turned, clean and precise, and resumed his march across the mat, boots striking stone in unwavering cadence as the mist lifted from the headstones and the sacred mourning carried on. Drew's heels struck the black mat in the same measured cadence that had carried the mourning, and the terrace held its solemn geometry of stone, cloth, and oath. As he completed the next turn, the relief commander stepped to the edge and issued the command in a low, formal tone. Drew halted on center line and executed the transfer with the same precision that had governed every pass before it. No flourish, no delay. Just duty handed from one sentinel to another like a torch that never touched the ground. He stepped clear, overcoat folded over one arm, expression unchanged, and moved down the service walk while visitors still lingered at the rail in respectful silence. At the corridor door, a duty NCO intercepted him with clipped instructions. Temporary ceremonial attachment. Reagan National, Military Dignity Transfer Corridor, immediate departure. A Gold Star family movement had tightened the timeline, and Airport Command wanted an old guard presence at the priority lane before the next wave of civilian boarding. Drew answered with one word. Understood. Radio chatter threaded through the vehicle as it pulled away from Arlington and merged into morning traffic. October light climbed over the bridges, flattening what remained of the mist into pale glare across concrete and glass. To civilians, the airport was movement and logistics. To Drew, it was another perimeter with emotional stakes disguised as routine. He adjusted his gloves once, then sat still, eyes forward, reading intersections, shoulders on sidewalks, hands near door lines, all the old habits awake without being invited. When he stepped into Terminal 2, the place had already built its own pressure. The air smelled of coffee, rolling suitcase rubber, and jet fuel carried in faint breaths every time the sliding doors opened. Flight boards flickered in blue and white over polished tile. Public address announcements folded over each other in practiced calm. A red-striped lane had been cordoned near a side checkpoint with clear signage. Dignity Corridor, authorized family transfer only. The stanchions were clean chrome, the rope line taut, the floor markings crisp. Inside that lane waited 3 military families and 1 airport wheelchair team. A woman in her 30s held a garment bag that carried the shape of a dress uniform beneath plastic. An older man with a cane wore a faded battalion cap and kept one hand on the handle of a small roller bag, as if he needed the anchor. Near the front sat a 9-year-old girl in a wheelchair, shoulders squared with the fierce seriousness children sometimes wear at funerals. In her fist, she held a folded unit patch so tightly that the stitched edge had left a mark across her palm. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering something that looked like a breathing count. Drew took his assigned point at the lane's opening. He stood in old guard blues with every crease sharp enough to cut glass, brass bright, white gloves pristine, posture locked and unyielding. He did not posture for attention. He became the boundary. The terminal noticed him in fragments. An elderly Marine in a VFW cap rose from a seat 2 rows back and shifted his weight forward. 2 teenagers who had been filming each other near a charging station lowered their phones and stared. A mother with a stroller drew it closer to the wall to clear space. A TSA supervisor touched 2 fingers to her earpiece and kept scanning the flow. Then the disruption came hard and loud. Special Agent Victor Hale cut through the crowd from the far concourse with the velocity of a man accustomed to doors opening before he reached them. He wore a dark tailored suit, narrow tie, mirrored watch face, and cufflinks that flashed each time his hand moved. He carried no visible luggage. His jaw was set in irritation before he even reached the rope line. When the stanchion blocked him, he slapped a federal badge against the chrome post with a crack that turned heads across 3 gates. "Federal movement," he barked. "Open it." Drew did not move. Hale stepped closer, eyes flicking once over the ceremonial uniform as if cataloging it under decorative. His lip curled. "Move, parade boy." He shoved his shoulder toward the opening, trying to split Drew off his mark the way a late traveler bullies through a boarding queue. The red rope trembled. The wheelchair attendant froze. The girl's fist opened for a split second, and the folded patch slipped to the tile. The terminal went still. What Hale saw in front of him was polished brass, white gloves, and a silent soldier in ceremonial dress. What he did not see was the man inside that stillness. A combat veteran trained to read threat vectors from shoulder angle and hand speed. A sentinel who had learned in foreign dust that arrogance often arrived before violence, and a guardian who understood that this lane was not a convenience channel, but a corridor of grief for families carrying the weight of names cut into stone. Drew neither blinked nor answered. His gaze shifted 1 inch, no more, and tracked the child's left hand as it trembled twice near her lap, palm down, then closed. Not random movement. A signal. Distress in miniature. At the same instant, he clocked Hale's right shoulder dropping, elbow tightening, center line drifting toward the wheelchair position. The same pre-motion cues he had studied in alleys where hesitation cost lives. Internally, his awareness snapped into a clear grid: distance to contact, lane width, bystander density, secondary exits, likely response times from airport police, collateral risk around the child. Outwardly, he remained a wall. The crowd held its breath with him. The Marine's knuckles whitened over his cane. One of the teenagers whispered, "Is that guy serious?" and received no answer. The mother with the stroller stopped rocking it. The TSA supervisor leaned into her radio and spoke too quietly for anyone but the headset to hear. Hale thrust the badge higher, inches from Drew's face, and drove his shoulder forward again, as if metal credentials could rewrite the purpose of the line painted at his feet. The little girl looked up, eyes wide but steady, and reached down toward the dropped patch with fingers that shook. In that suspended second, the airport stopped being an airport. It became witness. One boundary on polished tile became the dividing line between service and entitlement. Between a family moving toward Arlington with dignity and a man convinced rank could cut to the front of memory. No one spoke. The pause was real all the same, because tension had reached the point where time no longer moved in minutes. It moved in fragments, a breath held too long, a hand tightening on a wheelchair grip, the dull buzz of a gate scanner 3 rows away sounding suddenly distant, almost irrelevant. Drew's face stayed unreadable, carved from discipline, yet inside him every instinct was awake and ordered. He did not feel panic. He felt sequence. First protect the vulnerable lane, then control approach angle, then establish command language, then force institutional hand if voluntary compliance failed. He had built that sequence in places where rules were unclear and consequences were immediate. Here, inside domestic calm and fluorescent light, the same framework applied with even greater restraint. Because civilians stood within arm's reach and grief stood in the lane behind him. Hale mistook silence for weakness and took one more half step, enough to bring polished shoes over the red stripe. His cufflink caught the overhead light like a camera flash. "I said move," he snapped, voice climbing, badge still held high. "You're blocking federal business." The words bounced against tile and glass and died there. They carried authority as performance, not law. Around them, the crowd's expressions hardened into a shared recognition that had nothing to do with technical jurisdiction and everything to do with moral order. The elderly Marine's jaw set. The teenagers stood still now, phones forgotten at their sides. A man in an airline blazer took one instinctive step toward the lane, then stopped when he saw Drew's posture and understood someone had already taken control. At 07:48, exactly 8 minutes after Drew entered the terminal, Airport Command acknowledged the TSA supervisor's call and patched in federal security on a recorded line. The supervisor kept her voice low, eyes fixed on the lane. "Priority corridor interference. Request immediate command presence." She listened, nodded once and gave no outward sign beyond that. The child in the wheelchair bent carefully, reached, and recovered the folded patch from the floor. She held it against her chest with both hands now, as if bracing something that could break if she let go. Drew saw the motion without turning his head. He also saw her chin lift by a fraction, a small, stubborn effort to stay composed in a space where adults were suddenly loud. That detail registered as clearly as any tactical cue. Protect dignity first. Hale's badge hand wavered, then steadied. He was waiting for intimidation to produce motion and could not compute why it failed. To him, uniforms sorted by presumed power. Investigative shield over ceremonial braid, agency status over silent post. He had no framework for a sentinel whose obedience was to a tradition older than his task force and whose restraint had been forged under pressures he had never seen. He believed he was confronting an obstacle. He was confronting a vow. The lane remained closed. Drew's boots stayed planted, heels aligned on the stripe, shoulders square, one gloved hand resting near the seam of his trouser leg, the other free at chest height, distance from the rope if he needed to secure space without force. His breathing stayed slow and quiet. Even his stillness was deliberate communication. No aggression offered, no ground surrendered. Seconds stretched. Public announcements kept running somewhere above them about boarding groups and unattended baggage. But those sounds belonged to another world now. In this one, a father's memory rode in a child's fist. A line on tile marked who would pass with honor, and a federal badge hovered in midair, waiting to discover that authority without humility collapses the instant it meets sacred duty. Drew held the position and waited for the next word, the next movement. the next lawful point of decision. Drew held the position and waited for the next word, the next movement, the next lawful point of decision, while Terminal 2 pressed around him in fluorescent glare and contained panic. The polished tile reflected legs, wheels, and rope posts in broken bands. Overhead, boarding calls rolled through speakers in calm, synthetic cadence that no longer matched the human tension at gate level. Coffee steam drifted from a kiosk 30 yards away, cut by the metallic tang of jet fuel each time the concourse doors breathed open. A baggage cart rattled over a seam in the floor and went quiet. A toddler fussed once, then fell silent when his mother drew him close and turned his face toward her shoulder. The lane stayed fixed in red and chrome like a painted oath, and at its mouth stood Drew Kim in old guard blue, straight-backed and unyielding, a ceremonial silhouette carrying combat stillness. The crowd around the stanchions had become a catalog of the nation in miniature, each witness held in sharp detail by the gravity of the moment. The elderly Marine in the VFW cap had a silver hearing aid tucked behind one ear and a forearm tattoo faded to blue-gray beneath his jacket cuff. He stood with his cane planted like a guidepost and his jaw locked. Two teenagers in matching school hoodies kept their phones lowered at their thighs, screens dark, eyes wide with the sudden understanding that some scenes are not content. A woman in airport concessions uniform, apron still tied at her waist, leaned around a pillar with one hand over her name tag. An airline pilot waiting deadhead in shirt sleeves held his roller bag handle and did not blink. Near the wheelchair, the girl's mother knelt with her own shoulders rigid, one hand at her daughter's back, her knuckles white from controlled restraint. Drew's uniform looked less like cloth than architecture. The coat sat flawlessly across his shoulders, deep midnight wool without a wrinkle, seams aligned with mathematical exactness from collar to cuff. Brass insignia caught the terminal light in hard, disciplined flashes. His tie knot sat centered with uncompromising precision against a collar that lay flat as machine metal. His white gloves were spotless, fingers relaxed yet ready, each movement economical enough to disappear unless one knew where to look. His trousers broke cleanly over boots, polished to a mirror shine, the leather reflecting red lane stripes and ceiling panels in curved fragments. Even his breathing obeyed order, ribcage rising and falling in measured intervals that telegraphed neither fear nor aggression. He did not perform stillness, he inhabited it. At the edge of that stillness, the 9-year-old in the wheelchair held her folded unit patch against her chest with both hands, elbows tucked in as if sheltering flame from wind. The patch was olive thread and black border, corners softened by handling, one side slightly frayed where fingers had worried it through a long morning. Her chin had a tremor she refused to let travel farther. Beside her, the wheelchair attendant stood half-turned, one foot forward, eyes darting between Drew and Hale, ready to move only when someone gave a lawful cue. Behind them waited a gold star father with an old cane and polished shoes, a widow carrying the garment bag with a dress uniform inside, and a younger brother in a borrowed blazer 2 sizes too large, shoulders trying to fill grief with posture. The Dignity corridor held not passengers, but people in transit between loss and ritual, and Drew guarded that corridor with the same moral geometry he had guarded marble. In the long, suspended seconds, his mind executed its practiced expansion. He counted distances, measured angles, tagged surfaces, and listened past noise for intent. Yet beneath that tactical grid, another landscape rose with equal force, not to distract him, but to steady him. Arlington at first light, mist sliding low between white headstones, the black mat dark as a river stone, the tomb face receiving dawn with austere calm. He could feel the October chill from that hill as distinctly as the conditioned airport air on his cheeks now. He could hear the cadence of his own boots striking the mat in exact intervals, a rhythm that had already ordered this day. 21 steps. Halt. Turn. 21 back. That ritual had not ended when he left the cemetery. It had followed him into this terminal as a living standard. He remembered individual faces from the morning in crystalline fragments, each one part of the same national witness now reassembled at the airport. The veteran nurse in a pale coat, fingers clasped over a folded program, breathing through a private ache while he passed. The high school student with purple streaks in her hair, wiping her eyes and then standing straighter, surprised by her own response. The grandfather on the rail answering his grandson's whisper without moving his gaze. He does it anyway. The Gold Star widow with a small pin on her lapel, closing her eyes for one full cycle, lips moving through a prayer she kept to herself. The janitor at the rear path removing his cap and standing by his cart in unplanned reverence. Arlington had gathered them without invitation, and this terminal had gathered their counterparts again. Workers, children, veterans, travelers, all pulled into a single moral frame by one line on the floor. Drew's eyes remained level on Hale's center mass, but memory opened deeper as his nervous system held steady under pressure. He had not been born to ceremony. He had been forged in places where sound arrived faster than thought, and where silence after contact carried names that no headline would ever print. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him terrain and endurance in a dialect of dust and heat. In Kunar, he learned to read mountain shadows for movement, and to trust the soldier who covered his blind side more than he trusted luck. In Kandahar, he learned doorway geometry the hard way, how a hinge line and shoulder angle could announce violence half a second ahead of action, and how half a second could separate a homecoming from a folded flag. His third deployment, Syria, gave him the scar that still flared in phantom heat along his left ribs whenever adrenaline rose. Outside Manbij, his element had moved through a shattered block at dusk, concrete breathing grit under rotor wash from a distant bird, comms clipped and sparse. The blast came from a secondary device near a collapsed storefront. Not cinematic, not loud in the way movies lie, just a hard, concussive strike that erased orientation and filled the world with dust and ringing. Shrapnel tore across his side. He stayed upright through reflex and training, dragged a teammate behind partial cover, and kept firing disciplined bursts while the team repositioned civilians out of the kill corridor. For that action, he later received a Bronze Star with Valor, a medal he kept boxed because metal did not explain cost. The cost had a name: Staff Sergeant Luis Ortega. Ortega had been the platoon's ballast and spark at once, a man who could clear a room with hard precision and then spend chow making exhausted soldiers laugh until they remembered they were still human. He had broad hands, a crooked grin, and a running talent for turning embarrassment into morale. Once, in a cramped mess tent between missions, he dropped his tray in front of half the company, potatoes and chicken scattering across boots and concrete, and threw both hands up with theatrical dignity. "Guess I'm training for the Chow Line Olympics." Men who had not smiled in days laughed into their sleeves. That was Ortega's gift. He stitched laughter into stress fractures before they split. Outside Manbij, Ortega took the hit that would not let him come home. Drew reached him in smoke and dust, gloves slick with grime, pressure dressing cinched, voice controlled, reporting status while willing time to slow. Ortega's eyes tracked him, clear even then, and he used what breath he had left for an instruction, not a plea. "If I don't make it home, Stand where silence is loudest and guard it for me. Drew answered with words he barely heard himself speak because the medevac clock and mission grid were still running in his head, because soldiers bargain against the inevitable until the last lawful seconds. Ortega squeezed his wrist once, a firm pressure, then let go. The evacuation lifted without him. Home did not soften that memory, it sharpened it. Drew returned with a citation, a scar, and a nervous system calibrated for threat in ordinary rooms. Grocery aisles felt too narrow. Fireworks sounded like unfinished business. Sleep came in fragments. Anger arrived quick and left him colder each time. He did what disciplined men do when grief has no obvious container. He sought structure stronger than mood. The old guard did not offer therapy and slogans. It offered standards, repetition, and purpose under public scrutiny. Selection was exacting. Uniform prep consumed hours over details civilians might miss. Bearing required control at a level that made ego useless. At the tomb, he found a framework that could hold rage, sorrow, loyalty, and memory in the same chest, without letting any of them spill onto those he was sworn to protect. He learned that each element of the ritual carried meaning beyond appearance. The 21 steps echoed the highest honor rendered. The pauses were not empty. They were charged intervals in which the nation could hear itself remember. The immaculate uniform was not vanity, but respect made visible, a promise that the unknown dead would never receive carelessness from the living. The black mat was a threshold. The rifle was steadiness. The turn was continuity. Day after day, in heat, rain, wind, and winter bite, he repeated the sequence until repetition became prayer with boots on stone. He did not imagine Ortega in every pass. He carried him in all of them. He carried names he never learned. He carried families he would meet only in moments like this one, when protocol had to stand between grief and intrusion. 3 days after he earned the Tomb Guard identification badge, Drew visited Arlington at dusk, out of sequence, off-duty, coat buttoned against river wind, and stood at a distance where he could watch another sentinel cross the mat. He remembered the precise sensation then. Not pride, not relief, but alignment, as if the fractured internal compass from Syria had finally found true north. The tomb did not erase loss, it gave loss direction. From that day forward, he treated every assignment linked to memorial transfer as an extension of the same vow, whether the ground beneath him was marble or airport tile. Now in Terminal 2, that vow governed his restraint as completely as any written regulation. He did not need to outshout Hale. He needed to preserve dignity, hold lawful boundary, and prevent harm in a crowded civilian space. His internal sequence remained clear and unbroken. Protect the child's lane, maintain distance, issue command language at the right threshold, and defer adjudication to arriving authority once immediate safety was secured. The framework that had carried him through mountain outposts and urban rubble carried him through fluorescent concourse light with equal discipline. Hale's badge still hovered near eye level, its edge catching white light in sharp flashes, but the emotional center of the scene had already shifted to ground Hale did not control. Around them, witnesses understood, some with military memory and some with simple civic instinct, that power, without humility, had stepped into the wrong corridor. Drew remained composed, eyes hard and unreadable, shoulders square, boots anchored on the stripe. He stood where silence was loudest in that terminal, and guarded it for the fallen, for their families, and for the friend who had asked him to keep watch when he could no longer do it himself. Across from him, Special Agent Victor Hale treated Drew's silence as an opening, because silence in Hale's world usually meant compliance delayed by confusion. Hale had built a career inside one of the government's most visible counter-terror portfolios, the kind of unit that briefed cameras after raids and pushed polished talking points before the ink dried on incident reports. His file carried commendations for operational tempo, interagency initiative, and high-risk apprehension support. His name had appeared in airport security memos, congressional hearing binders, and 2 magazine profiles that called him relentless with a grin that looked better in print than in person. In every photograph, the details matched. Tailored suit, squared shoulders, badge angled for maximum recognition, one expensive watch peeking beneath a crisp cuff as if authority needed jewelry to stay visible. People around federal corridors knew his habits. He moved fast, spoke over process, and invoked urgency as a universal solvent for protocol. At field offices, junior staff learned to step aside when his stride came down a hallway. At checkpoints, he flashed credentials before introducing himself. At briefings, he stood near the projector, never the back wall, and let others catch up to his conclusions. None of that had gotten him burned badly enough to force correction. On days when his pressure produced results, supervisors called it initiative. On days when it bruised people, they called it rough edges and moved on. Momentum had protected him from humility. At the dignity corridor, momentum met a boundary that did not negotiate. Hale's badge remained raised between 2 fingers, the metal edge glinting under terminal lights like a challenge coin turned into a weapon. He was broad-shouldered but soft around the middle, in the way of men who sat through as many briefings as they ran. His hair was cut close at the sides, expensive at the top, and his jaw carried the permanent set of someone who had practiced irritation into an identity. Cufflinks flashed again when he jabbed a finger toward the red stripe. "You heard me," he said, voice pitched to Carey. "Federal business. Open the lane." Drew did not answer. The refusal, delivered without sound, drew more eyes than shouting would have. A gate agent paused mid-scan with a boarding pass in hand. A baggage handler stopped near the service door and left his cart idling. An older woman, wrapped in a navy shawl, rose from her seat with both palms on the armrests, then stood motionless beside her suitcase. The little girl in the wheelchair kept the folded patch against her chest and watched over its top edge, shoulders held tight as wire. Hale took Drew's stillness personally, and he made that mistake in public. He leaned in until his badge nearly touched the front of Drew's coat and let contempt roughen his tone. "What are you, a museum guard? Move, parade boy." The words landed across polished tile like something dropped and dirty in a chapel. A low murmur moved through the bystanders. Not loud, not chaotic, just unmistakable. The elderly Marine with the VFW cap shifted one step forward and planted his cane. One of the teenagers whispered, "He can't say that," and his friend answered, "He just did." What Hale still did not understand, what he had no framework to measure, was that Drew was not holding that lane because an airport manager wanted visual ceremony. Drew was there because the 3rd Infantry Regiment had been tasked to protect dignity movements tied to Arlington honors, and because the red stripe behind him contained people carrying a fallen service member toward the final choreography of military remembrance. The lane was operational, legal and sacred at once. It was not a shortcut. It was a promise. Hale had read none of that context or ignored it when he saw the dress blues. His assumption stayed simple. Ceremonial equals optional. Optional yields to federal credentials. Therefore, this soldier yields to me. He shifted his weight onto his lead foot and let his shoulder drift toward the opening again, trying to slip the line by body pressure instead of argument. Drew tracked the motion without turning his head. The angle of Hale's right elbow tightened. The badge hand rose higher, a distraction line. His left hip rotated toward the gap between stanchion and post. It was not an attack. It was a practiced bully move, refined in crowded places where most people avoided contact and stepped back to keep the peace. Drew did not step back. At 0751, Airport Command confirmed over radio that senior military liaison had been notified and was moving from Fort Myer with airport police support. The TSA supervisor near the kiosk kept one hand at her earpiece and her eyes on Drew's shoulders, waiting for any signal that force might become necessary. She did not get one. Drew gave her the same profile he gave everyone: upright, controlled, unreadable, hands quiet, boots planted exactly on his side of the boundary. Inside that composure, his body had already shifted into full readiness, his calves loaded, his center of gravity lowered by a fraction invisible to civilians. His left hand relaxed enough for speed while his right stayed clear to block or redirect without striking. His breath shortened from ceremonial cadence to tactical pacing: 4 count in, 4 count hold, 4 count out, keeping pulse under control so vision stayed sharp at the edges. He mapped the lane again in less than a second. Wheelchair front axle, 6 feet behind him. Mother kneeling to the right, cane-bearing grandfather to the left rear. Stanchion post at his 9 o'clock. Open concourse at his 3 hard barrier of a column 10 yards behind Hale. The same old grid from Kandahar and Manbij laid itself over chrome and tile. He saw too much to look surprised by anything. He noticed the tremor in Hale's badge hand. Not fear, just anger translated through tendons. He caught the reflection of a security officer advancing in the window glass before the officer entered direct sight line. He heard the tiny scrape of the child's shoe against the wheelchair footrest and understood she was bracing. He registered the mother's free hand opening and closing once at her thigh, grounding herself to prevent panic from spilling into the lane. Outwardly, none of that reached his face. He remained what the crowd needed him to be: a fixed point. Hale mistook that fixed point for provocation and escalated again. He lowered the badge just long enough to thumb a credential wallet open with theatrical force, displaying seal, photo, and agency stripe as if legal authority increased with volume. "You're obstructing a federal agent," he said. "Last warning." He reached for the rope with his free hand. The crowd's noise collapsed into a single inhalation. A father near gate C-24 drew his daughter behind his leg. The pilot in shirt sleeves set down his roller bag and took 2 careful steps closer without crossing into the lane. The concessions worker pressed her knuckles to her mouth. Even the terminal announcements seemed distant, as though the speakers had been moved down a long hallway. Drew's internal state sharpened further, not toward anger, but toward sequence. If Hale cleared the rope, Drew would have to intercept the shoulder line, arrest forward momentum, and pivot him away from the wheelchair without driving him to the ground in front of families already carrying enough. If Hale swung the badge hand, Drew would trap wrist, redirect outside lane, and hold until law enforcement made physical contact. If Hale stopped short, Drew would preserve space and issue command language once, clear and formal. Each option sat ready, ranked by least force required. His jaw stayed loose. His eyes never left Hale's center mass. 3 yards behind Drew, the little girl lifted the patch to her lips and touched it there for a second, then lowered it and squared her shoulders again. Her mother saw it and swallowed hard. The older man with the cane straightened, as much as his spine allowed, and shifted his grip from handle to shaft, not threatening, just preparing himself to stand through whatever came next. The lane had become a line of witness. Veterans, students, airport workers, tourists, airline staff, families in transit, all of them now understood that the argument in front of them was not about cue position. It was about whether grief could be ordered to wait while ego passed through. Hale hooked 2 fingers under the rope and yanked it upward. Chrome posts rattled. The red cord snapped taut and then slackened in his hand. Drew moved exactly 1 inch forward with his upper body and no farther, enough to close the opening before Hale could exploit it, enough to signal capacity without throwing the first physical action. The movement was so precise it looked mechanical, a gate aligning with its frame. Gas broke from 2 directions at once, then died. Hale's expression shifted for the first time. Not surrender, calculation. He had expected a ceremonial guard to flinch backward or argue. He had not expected this disciplined refusal that gave him no dramatic hook and no legal pretext. He stood with rope in hand, badge at chest level, caught between doubling down and discovering where the next consequence would come from. Down the concourse, 2 airport police officers appeared at a controlled jog, one hand on radio, eyes scanning past the crowd toward the red-striped lane. Behind them moved the federal security director, tie loosened, face set, flanked by an operations manager with a clipboard hugged to his chest. They were still 20 seconds out. Drew noted distance and kept still. Hale saw them too and rushed his decision. He released the rope, drove his shoulder toward the gap again, and started to speak over the movement, voice hard with borrowed command. "I said move." Drew held his ground, every muscle coiled beneath immaculate wool, and the terminal waited on the edge of the next word. The word never finished. Hale's shoulder drove forward, badge hand high, and Drew moved for the first time with the controlled speed of a gate locking into steel. 1 measured step, no rush, no flourish. His right boot cut across the stripe and planted, toe aligned to the lane's edge, while his left followed just enough to seal the gap Hale had tried to force open. At the same instant, 1 white-gloved hand rose to chest height between badge and corridor, palm outward, fingers straight, not striking, not grabbing, just an unmistakable command barrier drawn in air. Gasps cracked across the terminal. Drew's face stayed carved and unreadable, but inside him, every calculation hit its final line. Child protected, wheelchair clear, bystanders outside contact arc, officers 12 seconds out, legal threshold met. He let that certainty settle into his voice, low enough to avoid panic, hard enough to cut through ego. "Agent Hale, this lane is for the fallen and their families. Step back now." The name stopped him colder than the raised hand did. Hale froze mid-lean, his momentum stalling in visible increments. First the shoulder, then the elbow, then the badge hand hovering uselessly in front of Drew's glove. For 1 suspended beat, he looked less like a federal operator and more like a man who had run into a door he had been certain would open. He had expected argument, maybe fear, maybe procedural stalling. He had not expected perfect command language, precise identification, and 0 emotional leakage from the soldier he had labeled decorative. The red rope swayed once and went still. Behind Drew, the little girl in the wheelchair held her patch against her sternum and watched over her knuckles, breathing in quick, shallow pulls that she fought to control. Her mother's free hand pressed against the wheelchair handle so tightly her wedding band dug into skin. The older man with the cane stood planted beside them, chin lifted, eyes fixed on Drew with the silent recognition of someone who had seen disciplined men hold lines under worse conditions. Hale tried to recover ground with volume. "You don't get to order me. I'm federal." Drew did not yield an inch. "Step back." No extra words, no threat. Just lawful instruction delivered with ceremonial calm that felt heavier than shouting. The crowd felt it. The pilot near gate C-24 exhaled audibly and set his shoulders down. One teenager whispered, He said his name, and the other answered. He's done. The elderly Marine's cane tip clicked once on tile as he shifted, and then even that small sound disappeared into the silence around the lane. Hale's jaw flexed. His badge wavered. He looked past Drew for institutional backing that was no longer his to claim, scanning for uniforms that might validate him. What he found were dozens of civilian eyes, and not one ally willing to cross that stripe with him. The concessions worker by the pillar lowered her hand from her mouth but did not look away. A gate agent stood rigid with scanner in hand, boarding forgotten. The TSA supervisor remained at her post with her earpiece pressed in, watching the lane with the stillness of someone who knew command presence when she saw it. At 0753, less than a minute after Drew's command, airport police reached the cordon and halted on Drew's flanks, waiting for direction rather than lunging in. That restraint mattered. It signaled that this was no brawl. It was a protocol breach being corrected in full view of the public. Hale made one final attempt to bully physics. He angled his shoulder toward the opening again. Not a full push now, just a testing drift. A man probing for weakness he could still exploit. Drew's raised hand shifted 2 inches, matching the line and closing it before contact. The movement was so clean it looked pre-measured. "Do not cross," Drew said. Hale stopped. Fully this time. Down the concourse, a new figure emerged from the flow of uniforms and airport staff with unmistakable command gravity. Brigadier General Eleanor Whitaker moved fast without appearing hurried. Service coat sharp, silver at her temples, rank bright against dark fabric, posture straight as a drawn blade. Beside her came the airport operations chief and the Federal Security Director's deputy, carrying a phone on active speaker, the director's voice already audible before they reached the lane. 2 more airport police officers followed at controlled pace, creating space between the crowd and the confrontation without touching anyone. Whispers rippled and then collapsed into silence as Whitaker stepped into the red-striped corridor and took in the entire tableau in one sweep. Hale inside the boundary, badge still out. Drew squared at the lane mouth, the child in the wheelchair, the waiting Gold Star families. Police ready but restrained. "Halt where you are," Whitaker said. Hale turned, relief flashing across his face for half a second as he saw rank, then fading when he recognized whose chain he had stepped into. "General, I have active federal movement." Whitaker cut him off. "You have no operational authority in this corridor." Her voice carried across polished tile with courtroom clarity. She did not raise it. She did not need to. The phone on speaker crackled, and the Federal Security Director's voice filled the lane, clipped and unmistakable. "Special Agent Hale, this is Director Ames. Confirm your current location." Hale hesitated. "Terminal 2, Priority Lane." "Incorrect designation," Ames replied. "You are in a military dignity transfer corridor supporting Gold Star family transit. You were explicitly briefed this morning on restricted access." A visible change passed through the crowd. Not excitement, not celebration, but collective confirmation that the line had legal spine as well as moral weight. The TSA supervisor lowered her hand from her earpiece and stood straighter. The older man with the cane closed his eyes once, briefly, then reopened them and kept watching. Hale tried one more time to salvage command. "Sir, I was pursuing time-sensitive federal tasking, and this ceremonial post blocked." Whitaker stepped half a pace forward, placing herself shoulder to shoulder with Drew. "Staff Sergeant Kim is not ceremonial in this assignment. He is posted authority for this lane under military protocol and airport coordination. You were given a lawful command to step back. You did not comply." The words landed like stamped metal. Director Ames came through the speaker again. Agent Hale, surrender lane position immediately. Present credentials to airport police for incident documentation. Effective now. You are removed from field activity, pending internal affairs review for misconduct and failure to follow interagency protocol. Hale stared at the phone, then at Whitaker, then at Drew's unmoving glove still held at barrier height. The badge in his hand suddenly looked small, a piece of metal without force behind it. Around him stood 4 police officers, a brigadier general, airport command, and a terminal full of witnesses who had watched him try to cut in front of grieving families. Do it now, Whitaker said. Hale lowered his badge. One officer stepped in, palm open. Credentials, sir. Hale handed them over without another word. The officer passed the credential wallet to his partner, who read the details aloud for body cam and incident log, then returned it only after recording was complete. The operations chief signaled to a nearby supervisor, who tagged the timestamp and camera sectors for evidence retention. The earlier radio call, now resolved, folded into formal process. Notification acknowledged, response executed, chain of command documented in real time. Whitaker turned slightly toward Drew without taking her eyes off Hale. Staff Sergeant Kim, report. Drew kept his gaze forward. Agent attempted unauthorized entry to Dignity Corridor, ignored 2 verbal directives, and advanced toward protected family lane. Boundary held. No physical force applied. Noted, Whitaker said. She faced Hale fully. You will depart this scene under escort. You will have no contact with these families. You will not re-enter any restricted military corridor today. Hale opened his mouth, then closed it. He gave one short nod that looked less like acknowledgement than impact settling in. Airport police escorted him out of the lane and into the concourse, 1 officer at each side, not dragging, not theatrical, simply final. As he passed the edge of the crowd, no one jeered, no one clapped. The silence was more severe than either. 2 teenagers watched him go with their phones still down. The Marine with the cane followed him with his eyes, then turned back to the lane and squared his shoulders toward Drew. By 07:57, the immediate disruption was over, but institutional closure continued with the precision of drill. The TSA supervisor gave her statement to airport police beside the stanchion. The operations chief confirmed camera footage from 3 angles had been flagged and secured. Director Ames, still on speaker, instructed his deputy to initiate formal referral paperwork before the hour ended and requested the military liaison report number for interagency attachment. Every thread tightened into record. Whitaker accepted the phone from the deputy and gave one final update. Director, corridor integrity restored. Families remain on schedule. Staff Sergeant Kim's actions were disciplined and correct. Ames answered without hesitation. Copy all. Commendation recommended. Whitaker ended the call and handed the phone back. Then she turned to the witnesses at the edge of the lane, speaking not as performance but as public instruction. This corridor exists to honor the fallen and protect their families in transit. That protocol is not optional. Thank you for holding space. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. A mother near the stroller wiped her eyes. The airline pilot placed a hand over his heart for 1 beat, then let it fall. The terminal's ambient noise returned in cautious layers. Boarding chimes, rolling bags, distant announcements, but the moral center of the scene remained where Drew stood. Whitaker gave Drew a small, formal nod. Resume your post, Staff Sergeant. Yes, ma'am. He lowered his raised hand, returned it to his seam, and re-established the exact stance he had held before the breach, shoulders square at the lane mouth, boots aligned on the stripe, gaze steady. The child in the wheelchair watched him, patch still pressed to her chest, and her breathing finally slowed into an even rhythm as the corridor opened again, to dignity, order, and the quiet authority that had refused to move. Drew held his post while the lane began to flow. The first family advanced at a measured pace, garment bag held high to keep the uniform inside from brushing the floor. The older man with the cane moved beside them, each step deliberate, each breath visible in the cool wash of conditioned air. The wheelchair attendant looked to Drew for confirmation before rolling forward, and he gave one short nod without breaking bearing. The little girl's eyes stayed on him until she passed his shoulder. Then she looked down at the folded patch and tightened her grip as if anchoring herself to someone still present in the room. Behind the stanchion, airport life resumed in muted layers. Boarding calls returned. Wheels rattled over tile seams. A barista called a name that no one answered for several seconds. Yet the people who had witnessed the breach still carried themselves differently. The two teenagers remained with their phones down, whispering now not with excitement, but with the stunned seriousness of people who had learned where a line truly lay. The mother with the stroller eased her child forward and paused long enough to whisper, "Remember this," before moving on. The concessions worker who had covered her mouth earlier stepped back toward her kiosk, then turned once more toward Drew and placed her hand over her heart before disappearing into the crowd. Whitaker did not leave immediately. She moved to the operations chief and the TSA supervisor at a side podium and closed the loop in plain sight, the way disciplined institutions restore trust after a public breach. "Report number?" she asked. The operations chief checked his tablet. DCA-T2-0753-441. 3 camera angles preserved, plus supervisor body cam. Chain of custody logged. Witness statements. Taken from Supervisor Tran, Officer Delaney, Officer Ruiz, and 3 civilian witnesses. Additional statements pending from gate staff. Whitaker looked to the TSA supervisor. "You made the initial call." Tran nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. At 0748. Priority corridor interference. I flagged military liaison and federal security simultaneously." Whitaker's tone remained formal. "Your call prevented escalation. Thank you." Tran swallowed, then answered with quiet force. "That lane matters, ma'am. My brother came through one like it at Dover." Whitaker held her gaze for a beat, then gave a short nod that carried more than thanks. At 08:05, the deputy's phone rang again. He stepped close, listened, and handed it to Whitaker. "Director Ames." She put it on speaker only long enough for the relevant outcome to be heard by the command personnel who needed it. Ames spoke in clipped cadence. "For record, Agent Hale has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending internal affairs investigation. Referral packet opened under misconduct and interagency noncompliance. Temporary credential restrictions are active. Written notification to his chain has been transmitted." Whitaker answered, "Copy. Corridor integrity restored. Families moved on schedule." Ames continued. "Staff Sergeant Kim's conduct is noted as exemplary restraint under provocation. Commendation memo is filed to the Military Liaison Office and Airport Command." Received. The call ended. No one applauded. They did what professionals do. They documented, confirmed, and resumed mission. Drew remained at the lane opening until the last family cleared the checkpoint. Then, on Whitaker's signal, he stepped from post and moved to the wheelchair staging point where the little girl waited beside her mother for the honor shuttle. Up close, she looked smaller than she had from the lane, all sharp courage and held breath. The patch in her hands was creased now from pressure. Drew stopped at regulation distance and lowered to one knee so his eyes were level with hers. His white gloves rested lightly on his thigh. "You did the right thing," he said. "That hand signal told me you needed space." Her voice came out thin but steady. "I practiced with Mom for crowded places." "You executed it clearly," Drew replied. "That helped protect your lane?" She looked down at the patch, then back up. "This was my dad's. He wore it in Afghanistan." Drew's expression did not break, but his voice softened by a single degree. "Then it carries his service. Hold it tight." The older man with the cane, who had stood behind her through the confrontation, drew himself upright and spoke toward Drew with the gravelly weight of age and old command. "Staff Sergeant, I was at Kaisan. I know what discipline under pressure looks like. You honored those families today," Drew answered with formal precision. "Thank you for your service, sir." The man gave a slight nod, the kind one soldier gives another when words have reached their limit. The shuttle coordinator called the transfer group. The dignity detail formed around the families and began moving toward the secured exit. As the wheelchair rolled forward, the little girl shifted the patch to her left hand and raised her right in a small, trembling salute. Drew returned it, exact and sharp. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing the moment into memory, then guided the chair toward the doors. By late afternoon, a cold wind had come up over Arlington, pushing thin clouds across a pale sky and laying long shadows between the white markers. Drew stood in the operations office beneath fluorescent lights and completed the final administrative line items from the airport incident before changing back to full tomb duty sequence. Evidence references were entered against the airport case number. Camera retention confirmation from Terminal 2 was attached. Supervisor Tran's initial call timestamp was cross-logged with airport police arrival and federal security direction. Whitaker's command statement and Ames's referral determination were both recorded in the after-action file. Nothing hung loose, nothing waited in ambiguity. The duty NCO reviewed the page, initialed the margin, and slid it back. "Clean report." Drew signed, closed the folder, and placed it in the secure bin for permanent archive. Outside, evening settled across the cemetery with the solemn clarity of winter arriving early. The marble at the tomb held the last light in muted silver. Flags along the avenues moved in restrained, steady pulses. Visitors gathered again at the rail. Veterans in old branch caps, families in heavy coats, two school groups quieter than children usually are at that hour, an elderly couple sharing one blanket across their shoulders. Near the center rail sat the little girl from the airport, now beside her mother and the cane-bearing veteran. The patch rested in her lap. She looked tired, but her spine was straight. Drew took his place on the black mat. His boots struck in perfect rhythm. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. The world narrowed to cadence and duty. Cold air entered and left his lungs in measured intervals. The rifle stayed steady against his shoulder. His face remained an unreadable mask of discipline, eyes locked on the points required by ritual. Yet the day moved through him with ordered clarity. The red stripe on airport tile, the badge lifted as entitlement, the child's practice distress signal, Whitaker's command voice cutting through noise, the speakerphone verdict that authority serves protocol or ceases to be authority at all. Each memory settled into place, not as distraction, but as confirmation of the same vow carried from combat to ceremony. Protect the vulnerable, hold the line, keep faith with the fallen. At 1740, as the sun dropped behind cloud, a visitor at the rear rail began speaking too loudly into a phone. Before the volume could spread, the elderly Marine from the airport touched the man's sleeve and said, "Not here." The man glanced at the mat, at Drew's pass, at the inscription, and ended the call without argument. Some lessons did not require reprimand once they had been witnessed in full. Drew completed another cycle. Heel strike, measured halt, precise turn. At the front rail, the little girl shifted in her wheelchair and lifted the folded patch with both hands, holding it at chest level the way someone holds a standard. Her mother placed a hand over hers. The veteran with the cane stood as straight as his body allowed and removed his cap. No one around them moved for several seconds. Drew reached center line, halted, and faced the crowd for the brief interval dictated by ceremony. His gaze did not roam, but in the disciplined sweep of his awareness, he found her there. Small shoulders squared, patch held steady, eyes fixed on him with the fierce concentration of a child learning how grief and pride can exist in the same breath. He turned and resumed his march. The wind skimmed the hill and carried the scent of stone and cut grass. Far below, traffic murmured beyond the cemetery walls, distant and irrelevant. Here, the rows of headstones stood in perfect formation, white and unending, each one a statement that memory had a place and a cost. The tomb rose above them in marble permanence. The flag moved against the evening sky. Drew's boots answered the stone in unwavering cadence. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. No badge could outrank that rhythm. No volume could rewrite that law. Real authority did not force its way to the front. It took its place in service to the fallen, and it kept that place whether anyone noticed or not. As dusk deepened, the visitors held their silence. The child lowered the patch gently back to her lap, and Staff Sergeant Drew Kim continued across the black mat, boots on marble, guarding the unknowns and the nation's memory in the same measured stride.